How does one survive a vampire? It was a cold October night, and the old bus rattled down the empty country road. Maria clutched her coat tighter around her body, trying to fend off the chill that seemed to seep from the bus's creaky windows. The bus driver, an older man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes, hadn't spoken since she boarded at the last town. His silence, paired with the dim flicker of the overhead lights, only added to the sense of unease that had been growing in Maria since she started her journey. She had been visiting her grandmother in the small town of Ashford, a place so remote that it felt like it was frozen in time. The visit had been pleasant enough, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the locals were hiding something from her. They had stared at her with wide eyes, whispered among themselves, and warned her to be cautious on her return trip. Her grandmother, frail but sharp, had been particularly insistent that she leave before nightfall. "You don't want to be on the road after dark," her grandmother had said, gripping her hand with a strength that belied her age. "Not in these parts." But Maria hadn't listened. She had lingered too long, enjoying the warm tea and her grandmother's stories, and by the time she boarded the bus, night had already fallen. The bus trundled along, its tires crunching over gravel as it approached a dense forest. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Maria glanced around, realizing that she was the only passenger left. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She leaned forward, trying to see the driver in the rearview mirror, but the angle made it impossible. "How much longer until we reach the city?" Maria asked, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet of the bus. The driver didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Maria felt a pang of unease but told herself she was just being paranoid. After all, the old man probably didn't hear her. She settled back into her seat, trying to relax. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. A sudden jolt made her gasp as the bus came to an abrupt stop. The engine idled loudly, filling the silence with its rumbling. Maria looked out the window, seeing nothing but the dark stretch of road and the thick trees that bordered it. "Why are we stopping?" she called out. But again, the driver didn't respond. Maria's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the air. A tension, a presence that made her skin prickle. Slowly, she stood up, gripping the back of the seat in front of her for support as the bus swayed slightly. The driver still hadn't moved. He sat there rigid, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Gathering her courage, Maria made her way down the narrow aisle toward the front of the bus. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The driver's skin seemed unnaturally pale, almost translucent in the dim light. His breath was shallow and there was an odd stillness to him, as if he were a statue rather than a living person. She hesitated, then reached out a trembling hand to touch his shoulder. The moment her fingers brushed his jacket, the driver turned to face her, and Maria recoiled in horror. His eyes were wide open, but they were blank, lifeless. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, far too long. Maria stumbled back, her mind racing. The driver wasn't alive, or at least, he wasn't anymore. Panic surged through her as she realized she was alone on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere, with something that wasn't human. The bus door suddenly hissed open, the noise breaking the stillness. Maria whipped her head around, staring into the dark night beyond the door. The cold wind howled through the open door, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall and gaunt, it moved with an unnatural grace, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was the man from the town, the one who had watched her from across the street, his gaze never leaving her. Only now his face was twisted into a grotesque smile, and his eyes gleamed with hunger. "Going somewhere?" The man's voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, as he stepped onto the bus. His gaze fixed on Maria, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She backed away, but the bus was only so big, and there was nowhere to run. The man took another step closer, his smile widening to reveal sharp, elongated fangs. Maria's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but fear had paralyzed her. She had heard the stories, the legends her grandmother used to tell her when she was a child. Stories of creatures that roamed the night, creatures that fed on the blood of the living. but she had never believed them. Not really. Not until now. The man's eyes bore into hers, and she felt a strange pull, as if he were drawing her to him, commanding her to submit. Her body began to move on its own, her feet shuffling forward even as her mind screamed at her to run. "No!" Maria cried out, fighting against the force that was compelling her forward. The man's smile faltered, and for a moment, his expression turned to one of irritation, but it quickly faded, replaced by the same predatory grin. "You can't fight it," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice. "You're mine now." Maria felt tears sting her eyes as she struggled against the invisible force. Her legs felt like lead, every step toward the creature a battle against an overwhelming power. But just as she felt herself losing the fight, a flash of light caught her eye. The cross. Her grandmother had given her a small silver cross before she left, insisting she wear it for protection. Maria had dismissed it as an old woman's superstition, but now in her moment of desperation, she reached for it, grasping it tightly in her hand. As soon as her fingers closed around the cross, the pull lessened. The man's eyes widened in surprise and he hissed, baring his fangs. Maria held the cross out in front of her, its small, shining surface the only thing between her and the nightmare that stood before her. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling but determined. The man snarled, but he didn't advance. Instead, he eyed the cross with a mixture of anger and fear. Maria took a shaky step backward, then another, keeping the cross between them. She glanced toward the open bus door, her only chance of escape. Gathering every ounce of strength she had left, Maria turned and bolted for the door. The man let out a furious roar, and she could hear him coming after her, his footsteps unnaturally fast. Maria leaped off the bus and onto the cold, hard road, her feet pounding the pavement as she ran into the darkness. The forest loomed ahead, but she didn't care. Anything was better than the horror behind her. She didn't dare look back. The sound of footsteps behind her grew fainter until there was only silence. Maria kept running until her legs gave out, and she collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath. The cross was still clutched in her hand, its metal cool against her palm. She knew she had escaped, but the terror of what had happened, what she had seen, would stay with her forever. And as she lay there, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Maria vowed that she would never, ever travel at night again.